They support all our webinars. And then, as Tom was saying, Gore Place, founded in 1935. All right, and so we'll get right into it. So the environment is constantly changing, but the reason I chose to start 400 years ago is because that's around the time that Europeans first made their permanent settlements in what we now call Massachusetts. And European colonization has had significant ecological implications for our region. And when I say our region, I'm mostly talking about the greater Boston area, although we'll talk a bit about New England in general and, some sort of Western Central Mass, but I try to keep it localized. So the Europeans, when they first came about 400 years ago, they came to what was, as you see on this map here, there was a confederation of a whole bunch of different Native American tribes. And the name for Massachusetts comes from the Massachusetts, who their name comes from the what we call Great Blue Hill. So they called it the Massachusetts, which means people of the hill. And so I'll talk a bit about the Massachusetts and the Nipmuc, and sort of how they interacted with their landscape and what their landscape looked like. So humans first came to New England about 10,000 years ago. And when Europeans arrived in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the tribes went by the names you see here. So they went by a whole bunch of names over the years, just like anywhere in the world. But when Europeans arrived, they were going by the Massachusetts in this area, the Wampanoag, the Nauset. And so in central and western Massachusetts, especially farther inland, the landscape would have resembled something like you see on the right. Even coastal areas might have looked like this. So this is called an old growth forest. An old growth forest is not impacted by humans. It hasn't been cut down before. It's just sort of on its own. It's growing. Trees are dying. They fall. They rot into the ground, and then more trees grow. And the only disturbances to this landscape would have been storms, insects, disease, fire from lightning. And while some ecologists suggested that these early indigenous tribes were using fire, controlled burning to control and change these landscapes, more recent research has shown that they probably weren't using a lot of burning. So really the only things that were impacting this old growth environment were the natives who were clearing it, not a whole lot, but cutting it down to make it a little more hospitable, a little easier for them to hunt. But for the most part, they're living along coasts and rivers because they rely a lot on fish and sort of foraging in those areas. And it's not until about 1,000 years ago, so not too long before the Europeans arrived, that they start practicing horticulture. So for thousands of years, various tribes hunted and gathered in this region. Then about 1,000 years ago, they start practicing horticulture, and they live semi-nomadically. So this is, these aren't the farms that the English are gonna set up. This is much more loose, a much more fluid type of horticulture where they're sort of moving from place to place, changing each year. And as many of you might know, they used what's called the Three Sisters method. So the Three Sisters method is when you grow corn with squash and pole beans. And this graphic is pretty helpful here. It shows how the whole thing works. So basically, beans, any legume, they're nitrogen fixing, which means they bring nitrogen from the air and put it into the soil, which is good for the soil. It makes it more fertile. Meanwhile, the beans can wrap around the corn stalk, and then the squash, which has really prickly leaves, protects the whole thing from predators. And so what you get at the end of the day is this really, really nice symbiotic system where you have beans, you have corn, you have squash, and they're all sort of complementing each other. And this is called companion planting today, and it's still commonly used. And the Native Americans are they're credited with starting this, or the first ones to do this. And the English, when they came, learned from this as well. So like I said, they lived on rivers and coasts, and hunted inland. These coastal tribes, like the Wampanoag or the Nauset, they relied a lot on marine resources. So these were a really high percentage of the diet. Um, and water was important for inland tribes as well. And this was also true for the English when they came. So it's no coincidence that the early settlements, from the English, were along coasts and rivers. So humans tend to gravitate towards water sources. And in the case of many early settlements like Plymouth and Boston, the land was also actively used and maintained by tribes like the Massachusetts and Wampanoag. So these aren't, it's not exactly a wilderness. Still, it was largely forested, and while it was far from an uninhabited wilderness, the forest here was much older and much larger than anything the colonists would have seen before. So, you read literature from that period, and the way that the colonists talk about it, you'd think that they were entering this, complete wilderness that no one's ever used, this pristine wilderness, which of course is not true. But you have to remember where they're coming from. England, the country they left, was almost entirely devoid of trees. So this is mostly cleared. It had been cleared for a long time for agriculture. So when the colonists came here, they saw these old growth forests that, granted, were being used, but the trees are much older, much bigger than anything they've seen. So naturally, they think, "Wow, this is a wilderness." So in the early 17th century, that the fact that it's a wilderness, which is sort of exciting at first because they have lots of resources that are untapped, it starts to become an obstacle, because the English like to farm. So the English, they practice what's called mixed husbandry. And so unlike the Native Americans who are practicing horticulture, which is just the raising of crops, the English practice agriculture, which is raising animals and crops together. And mixed husbandry is a distinctly British tradition, and it's manure and hay are at the heart of this. So you use manure from your animals, you throw them out in the field, helps fertilize the field. Then you need the hay to feed the animals, and then all that requires a ton of space. But it is an integrated system, so everything is complementing one another. So you have the animals who feed on the hay, create the manure, which fertilizes the soil, which helps grow your crops. So it's an integrated system, mixed husbandry, and it's also very communal. So when the English come here, as you see on the right here, this is the Plymouth plantation. They shared the commons and they built their houses close together. So they had what's called an infield outfield system. So they had these really big fields where they would share them. Their animals would pasture in the same place, and they would grow crops in similar areas, and then they would divide up their wood lots. So it wasn't like everyone had their own little enclosed property. It was more like this, where you'd have a house next to your neighbors. You're all close together, which was safer. If there's an attack, and then they would share their land, which was divided between parcels all around the area. So it wasn't just one enclosed property quite yet. All right. So, like I said, this mixed husbandry, it requires a lot of space. So unlike the Native Americans, which they were able to hunt and sort of alter their environment with minimal, I guess, their impact compared to the English is minimal. So of course they're hunting, and they do have an impact on the land. They weren't like like nowadays people think about the Native Americans as like these ecological people who sort of knew the land, and it's sort of like a caricature of what they really were. I think it's not totally accurate because they're humans, and their impact on the environment is similar to ours, although the difference between the English and the native land practices is that the English was much more expansive. So the English create a world of fields and fences. And so here's a picture here of a very bucolic pastoral landscape. And so, of course, they need to chop down a lot of trees. And this was really difficult at first because these trees are really old. These are old growth forests. These trees are 300, 400 years old. But the good thing is they're really sturdy. So, they're able to build tons of fences, and they're also able to build these stone walls. So we'll talk about that a bit later. But here is a picture from the Harvard forest dioramas. So that first picture, I'll go back to it. This is also from the Harvard forest dioramas. And these were created in the mid 20th century to help show sort of the process of environmental change in New England. And it's definitely a generalization. So obviously not everywhere in New England looked like this, but I'm going to use these as sort of a guide for us to sort of see how the average farm or how the landscape generally is tending to change. Although I don't think these dioramas perfectly capture the entire process, but they are a good resource. So here's a picture of an early family farm. So this would be mid to late 18th century. This is not too long after the English have arrived. So this is still a really forested landscape, although you see they've cleared some land. They've built a stone wall. They have some animals too. So over time, things, the economy growing as it does, the English are much more concerned with private property and with, sorry, oops. I'm making can I make the, I will try to make the pictures full screen. I'm not sure if I can do that. Sorry about that. Oh, no. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure if I can make these pictures full screen. I could zoom in on them. But okay, sorry about that. So go back a second. So this is mid to late 18th century, and farmers at this point are mostly self-provisioning. They're mostly providing for themselves. They're practicing mixed husbandry. They're raising their animals. They're raising their crops. They're sort of doing everything on their own, but they're also involved with the market. So if they need certain things, they can always get it from a neighbor or from someone traveling with certain goods. It's not every man for himself, although people are much more self-reliant than they are now. That these people provided most of what they needed for themselves. Now this starts to change in the mid 19th century. So we start breaking through the limits of local production in the early 19th century. So what this means is it's not totally necessary that farmers produce everything for themselves. So farmers for years and years relied on themselves for most of their food. Their family would work on the farm with them. And then, like I said, they could get other things that might have come up, other needs from the market if they needed to. But for the most part, they had to sort of diversify their property. They had to make sure that they had wood for fuel. They had to make sure that they had animals for meat, and manure, hay, sort of everything had to be going for them. But with industrialization, what this means is people can start to specialize. So as we start to industrialize and as transportation starts to improve, with the railroads shortly after this, and also just with roads being built, it's a lot easier to transport things, which means it's not necessary for each farmer to do everything himself. He can start to specialize on one thing, and then he can buy whatever else he needs using money he makes from selling his specialty. So what this leads to is forest cover declining sharply. And the reason for this is things like sheep. So sheep, for example, they love to eat grass. We have sheep here at Gore Place. They are they're ravenous creatures, and they need a lot of space for pasture. And so the reason these became really popular in Vermont and around Massachusetts is that suddenly their wool was really, really valuable in the early 19th century. There were a few different kinds of sheep that were particularly valuable. Merino was definitely the most popular. Basically, farmers no longer needing to produce everything themselves, they could specialize on really valuable products, and a lot of farmers chose to specialize in sheep. So they would, instead of growing a bunch of corn that you couldn't really sell, they said, you know what, I'm going to stop growing corn. I'm going to clear all this space. I'm going to have a pasture. I want to grow some hay, and I want to keep some sheep. And then I'm going to sell the wool, and I'll make a lot of money. And people did make a lot of money. And as you see here, so this is Moody Street, downtown Waltham, along the Charles River. You can see Prospect Hill in the background is you're starting to see it get cleared here. So hills, for places that you would never expect to see farms nowadays, were actually being farmed because suddenly you didn't really need to have this really nice and easily workable soil. You could just clear some upland pasture and let your sheep run wild, and that's what a lot of people did. So let me. So sorry, I lost my notes. All right. So the result of specialization is forest cover starts to decline sharply. So farmers all around the state, but especially in hillier areas farther west, so not really along the coast, they start to capitalize on their space, and they clear it. So whether it's sheep or whether they're doing cattle or dairy, they're specializing in valuable products, and they're clearing their land to do that. So back then, 100 years earlier, you had to keep some forest for fuel, like I mentioned. But now, you can buy your fuel. It's being brought down from northern Maine. You don't have to have everything you need on your property. You can just specialize, and the result is you start clearing everything. And so by the mid 19th century, you can see just how much forest cover drops off. New England, the entire region goes down, although Maine and New Hampshire don't drop as dramatically, but Massachusetts and Connecticut, southern New England, drops a lot. So Massachusetts reaches about 30% forest cover, a little less than 30% forest cover by the mid 19th century. And there are farms everywhere. Nowadays, when you walk through, and I'll talk about this later, you will walk through forests now and you'll see these old stone walls. That meant there was a farm there. Pretty much everywhere we walk, there used to be a farm, and most of it was cleared by the mid 19th century. So specialization. So like I said, farmers like to specialize in more valuable products. So it was really hard to compete in this new national market with the railroads, with improving transportation. Farmers need to specialize, and to compete, they start growing fruit, vegetables, dairy, and poultry. And these are all things that farmers were doing already. These aren't new products to them, but they are really valuable, and they can be produced really efficiently on a small amount of space. So after this huge purge of the trees, specializing in sheep and all different things that require a ton of space. Now with transportation being much better, farmers in Massachusetts suddenly have to compete with farmers in the Midwest. And what that means is they don't need all the space anymore. So it's impossible to compete with Midwestern farmers. They have this vast plains, just perfectly flat. It's not as rocky. And when the railroads can carry most of your goods, it's really not worth it anymore for these farmers to keep growing certain things, because someone in the Midwest can put it on a train and get it there much cheaper. But this doesn't mean agriculture was collapsing in Massachusetts. It means it was evolving. So we're specializing and we're using much less space, which means that the forest is starting to grow back. You see these little white pines coming in. But meanwhile, there's still Boston, there are still cities and mill towns and factories, and there are huge markets. And farmers around Boston actually still thrived. Even as much of the countryside started to look like this, they still thrived because there were these huge markets. So here's Waltham in 1910. You see the watch factory. And then here's Quincy Market in Boston. And you just see these are really big buildings, lots of people. These cities are growing quickly, and they're not farming, which is really important. These people that are living in cities, that are working in factories, they can't grow food for themselves. So the people who stay on the farm are able to make a lot of money because someone's got to grow the food. And Midwestern farmers can't do everything. Refrigeration is not what it is now. Transportation is getting better, but it's still not great. So things like fresh vegetables have to be grown locally. Milk has to be made locally. There are a whole bunch of things that local farmers could still thrive producing, because they still had that advantage being so close to these big markets. And Middlesex County leads the way. So like I said, being close to the markets was everything. Middlesex County, being right around Boston, became a very agricultural county. And by the turn of the century, it was 52% farmland. 52% of it was improved. And improved means it was being used. It was plowed. It wasn't just, a farm that had been taken over by the forest, like back here. So this wouldn't be considered improved. If it had grown over and it wasn't being used, that's unimproved farmland. That's just farmland. Improved farmland is farmland that's actively being used. And 52% of farmland, which is higher than the state average and much higher than the national average, was being improved and used in Middlesex County. And in 1890 and the next few decades, Middlesex County was leading the country in the value of market garden produce sold. And market gardens, if you're not familiar, are gardens that sell through a storefront. They're also are called truck gardens, and they're these, they're small scale gardens. They're not huge farms. They specialize in fruit and vegetables, and they sell it either in Quincy Market like this, or they sell it at a storefront like this. And Middlesex County has a lot of market gardens, and for this reason, the average per acre valuable of vegetables in Massachusetts is higher than anywhere else in the country. And this is Middlesex County is pulling the weight here, because all these little towns just outside of Boston, even some cities like Waltham, they're densely populated compared to the rest of the country, but there's plenty of space to grow food, and there's plenty of people to buy this food. So the business is doing really well in Middlesex County, and farmers are thriving. And so here are a few examples. So here's an old dairy farm in Brockton. And then Neshoba fruit belt, if anyone's familiar, there are still a lot of orchards that are still operating today. And they started specializing in apples in the early 20th century. And then poultry. So sadly, chickens, people decided that chickens did not need a lot of space. And so they crammed them into small coops. This is just one example, but basically they would feed these chickens a lot, which would help them lay more eggs. And they would confine them in smaller spaces because, like I'm saying, there's not a whole lot of space, and they're trying to extract as much value, as much profit out of their space as possible. And what this leads to is, chickens being in confined spaces, market gardens growing as much as they possibly can on a small amount of space, and then of course the fruit farmers, they're growing apples. Orchards are very close together, and they're starting to use different sprays, pesticides. Sort of farming is becoming more of a business, and the landscape is becoming it's starting to reflect that. So it's becoming a little more fragmented. And so here's downtown Boston, Washington Street. And so, like I mentioned earlier with the watch factory in Waltham, you see all these people walking around in the city. They're working at a department store like Jordan Marsh. They're shopping there. They're taking the trolley. These people aren't farming. And you might see this picture and think, how is agriculture still thriving only a couple miles away? And the answer is these people aren't farming, and someone has to feed them. And the Midwest eventually is going to do that. Most of our food now comes from all around the country. But back then, you could still do really well as a farmer, providing food for the city. And so even while these farmers are doing really well just around the city, farther inland, white pines start to take over. So this is, again, the Harvard forest diorama. And this would be around the turn of the century. This is the early 20th century. And these farms that are not specialized, that are not these, specialized in poultry or vegetables or fruit or dairy. These are these old family farms that can't keep up anymore. They start to get taken over by white pines. And now this may seem sad at first, and it is, because a lot of people were forced to move into cities and to give up farming. But if you stayed, these white pines, which were historically very pesky and really annoying because they grew really fast and they would pop up on your pasture, they suddenly became really valuable because of these. So this is a white pine box, and we actually have one of these in our collection at Gore Place. There's this huge boom in box making, and that's because suddenly there was a huge glut of white pine, and of course plastic wasn't a thing back then. So storing things, you would do it in a box like this, and white pines became really valuable. So these farmers who were down on their luck got one last something from the land before they were forced to move on. And so now let's go back to Middlesex County. So this is the early 20th century. The UMass Field Station is built in Waltham, and it's now the Waltham Community Farm, and this is right down the street from us. And so small farms are continuing to produce a ton of food, and UMass, which was founded right before the Civil War as an agricultural college, is starting to invest in Eastern Massachusetts, because obviously UMass is in Amherst. So they want an Eastern Massachusetts field station, and they put one in Waltham because this is centrally located in Middlesex County, in a very agricultural county. And they start doing a lot of agricultural research here. They start developing some new breeds, including the Waltham butternut squash. So anywhere you see butternut squash, it comes back to Waltham. So the original Waltham butternut is sort of the granddaddy of all butternut squash. There are a lot of variations of it, but it does come back to Waltham. And this just goes to show how rural or how agricultural this area was as late as the early and mid 20th century. So the landscape it's an industrial one, it's an urban one, but farmers are still thriving, and agricultural colleges are still investing in research in this area. And so now we'll see how farmland is declining here. So 1900, you start to see it fall. But again, farmland, even as farmland's declining, local farmers are meeting demand. There's still farmland's declining, but demand is not declining, and farmers who choose to stay on the farm are meeting demand. So even as the countryside starts to look like this, as this third growth forest starts to grow in after the farm has been abandoned and after the white pines have been cut, farmers can still do well if they specialize and if they live close to the city. And this is especially true during World War II. So a lot of people know the Victory Gardens in World War II, and the Victory Gardens are a big reason why Massachusetts was once again able to sort of turn back the clock a little bit and become an agricultural powerhouse in the 1940s. And that is because Massachusetts actually produced more food and made more money selling it than at any point in the state's history in 1945 and 1946. And that's because all of a sudden supply chains are upended, labor is scarce, people are fighting the war, but food still has to be grown. And even though much of the countryside looks like this, and while cities are expanding and sprawling, and Waltham has a lot of factories and it's really densely populated, there are still these market gardens. There are still what they're now calling Victory Gardens. There's still plenty of space that's being used, that's being efficiently used. People using land not as we do now, as sort of like ornamental or to look nice, but to be really productive and useful. And so here's the, let me zoom out a bit. So I think it cut off a bit, but the value of produce sold in Massachusetts. So you see farmland was declining this whole time. I want to go back, but although it holds steady here in the 1940s, and that's because all of a sudden, I'm sorry, the picture got cut off, but this is dairy, eggs, vegetables, all this, it all skyrockets during World War II. And sadly, after World War II, there was really no way that Massachusetts farmers could compete any longer. And that's because transportation was just so much faster than ever before. Refrigeration was so much better. And so even those market gardens, even those really efficient farmers couldn't really compete anymore. And so the landscape starts to look something like this. So this is Moody Street. You see the old department stores. And then here is I-95. So the interstate highway system They start building that in 1956. I-95 cuts right through Waltham. And of course, this means food can be transported much easier. And suddenly those farmers in Middlesex County don't have that advantage anymore. So this is what happens. So once again, the forest comes back. So the forest has been sort of marching back this entire time. And even as much of the city or much of the state is being taken over by trees again, farmers were doing well close to the city because they were being really efficient with their space. But once their comparative advantage is gone with new transportation, pretty much anywhere that's not a suburb or not a city that doesn't look like this, it starts to come back like this. And so the only thing left really is these old stone walls. And I think I mentioned this at the beginning. If you walk through the woods, and you can walk through the woods at Gore Place, you'll see we have these old stone walls. And if you're wondering how they got in the middle of the woods, it's because these woods weren't there. This was all farmland, and the farmers would take these stones that were lying in their fields that would come up every year because the process is called frost heaving. So when the temperature fluctuates on exposed soil, stones that are deep underground slowly make their way up as the temperature goes up and down, up and down. And then every spring, when the soil thaws, more rocks will come up. So farmers every year had to take these every spring and lug them to the side of their farm, and they would build these big walls on the edge of their property. And so that is why they're still there. All right. And so just a little recap. So you can see sort of the dichotomy here. So at its peak, at the peak of agriculture, at least space-wise, the state looks like this. Most of Massachusetts is cleared. Most farmers are growing most of what they need for themselves, or they're specializing in something, trying to make some more money. And then over time, they start to specialize a bit more because it's hard to compete with bigger farms. And then some farmers just can't keep up at all. And so they abandon their farms, and the trees start to grow back. And then, before you know it, we're getting all our food from, we get most of our vegetables from California. We get most of our dairy from the Great Lakes region. And there's still, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, there's still a lot of great local producers, and there's a lot of progress being made with that. But overwhelmingly, the state has been retaken by the forest, and really the only remnants of our agricultural past are sort of these old stone walls that you'll see in the woods. But like I said, there is reason to be hopeful, and Gore Place and other farms in Waltham are leading the way. So this is the Waltham Community Fields Farm here on the right, which is actually at the site of the old UMass Waltham Field Station that I mentioned earlier. And then here's Gore Place on the left, and we raise sheep and a whole bunch of crops. And let's see. So this combination of productive open space, like you see here, and also these woods, like we have at Gore Place, that's sort of the ideal, in my opinion, landscape, because we do have this agricultural history, and it's not something necessarily we should go back to, because as we can see just how much space it took up, and how many species and habitats were destroyed. But I think there's a happy medium somewhere. And today we have about 60% of our state is forested. That's more than double what it was in the mid 19th century. And I think there is plenty of space to grow local food. We have the capacity, like we saw in World War II. We have the labor and and if we have the will, we're more than capable of growing enough food to feed, or growing enough food to feed our region. And yeah, so there is reason to be hopeful, but at the same time, I hate to end it this way, but each year thousands of acres in Massachusetts are lost to development like this. And this is called hard deforestation. So while farming back in the 19th century is more of a soft deforestation, because as we see, the forest has returned, hard deforestation, the forest doesn't come back as easily. This building, it's hard to say what will happen to concrete and to asphalt. It's definitely a much longer process, and I think as a we look ahead and think about how we build a more sustainable and healthier state and community. We need to think about sort of the footprint we're leaving. And if you're passionate about the environment and you want to live in a healthier, more beautiful, more sustainable community, and who doesn't, I recommend you check out Wildlands and Woodlands. And they do a lot of great work. So they're actually part of Harvard Forest, which did the dioramas here. And they do a ton of research. So a lot of the statistics I cited about forest cover and about agriculture in our history comes from Wildlands and Woodlands. And sort of their whole mission is creating that happy medium that I talked about of farmland and also forest, and making sure that we have a healthy habitat that sort of honors our past and sort of channels some of that agricultural energy that we had, but also remembers how important the forest is, and how important it is that we maintain these diverse habitats, and make sure that our open spaces are productive. So I'll leave it right here. I'll stop the presentation here because there is reason to be hopeful. In recent years, farmers markets, CSAs, like the plant sale at Gore Place, there are a lot of local farmers doing a lot of great work, and they're doing it in limited space, with difficult circumstances. It's the saying, if you want to make a small fortune farming, you got to start out with a large fortune, and that's always been true. But with the right resources and with the right support, it is possible to have this reach that happy medium of having healthy forests and productive open spaces.
Fantastic. Thank you, Donnie. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
There we go. All right, folks. So if you have any questions, I think you should be able to put them in the Q&A. If not, I think there's a function there called raise your hand, and hopefully that'll work and we can turn on your mic so that you can ask a question. But if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. If not, we just thank you for attending this evening. And we want to say there are more webinars to come. Donnie has given 2 webinars on farming in the landscape, and this was a terrific sort of 10,000-foot view of the history of farming and land use, really, I guess is what you would call it, how people use it here at Gore Place. Here in Massachusetts. And, Donnie, you put me in mind of, you talked about the Victory Gardens. When I was a kid, the properties on either side of me, where I still am in the house where I grew up, and the properties on either side of me had full sun, and those were all gardened. They were quite, every inch of it was gardened for vegetables, and now they are lawns. And part of it is, I think, they're not. There's not the need because food is relatively inexpensive and available, but also the amount of time the people that lived there, they had full-time jobs, and then they spent every evening working in the garden. They didn't watch television. They didn't go to the movies. They didn't have the internet. They weren't distracted by other things. And that, I think, is part of it too, is the will. I know during the pandemic, a lot of people came to the plant sale and they were starting gardening for the first time. I don't know, once things opened up, how many of them continued to garden, because it's tough. It's tough to raise
Yeah.
vegetables and lose your tomatoes to insects or rabbits, or, it's not an easy way of producing food when the markets are so available. It seems to be such an abundance. Oh, we do have a question. I'm very glad. Um, Will the recording be available on the Gore Place website? I will. Thank you very much for that question. Yes, we will make the recording available as soon as I can process it and get it up, probably tomorrow. And I will ask our web site manager to put a link up there. So that's a great question. Yes, we will have a link. And I can also, if you want to email me at events, events, at goreplace.org, I will help you find a link to that as well. So that's a good question. And do we have any other questions? Let's see. Yes, we have another question. Fascinating to learn about, I'm going to read this out. Janet says, fascinating to learn about Middlesex County's ranking in agricultural production. Was this more about entrepreneurship or soil conditions? Fantastic, super informative presentation. Thank you very much, Janet. What do you think, Donnie? Was it more about entrepreneurship or soil conditions that made Middlesex County so fruitful?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And of course, it does have a lot to do with the environment. So Middlesex County is a really big county. It goes all the way up to Lowell, all the way down to, I think, like Sherburne, like that area. So yes, soil is a big part of it. So just having the favorable conditions, but I do think entrepreneurship and sort of just the desperation, the need to get by. I think people, like I mentioned, this is a really competitive environment. It's really hard to make it as a farmer, and just making the most of your space. That was the key. I think farmers in Middlesex County knew they had these big markets right next to them in Boston, and they knew that if they made the most of their space, if they focused on something really valuable like milk or like vegetables or poultry, they knew if they could specialize in that and do it better than the next guy, then they could do really well. So I think it does come down to entrepreneurship, and also that opportunism, just being opportunistic and taking advantage of their proximity to Boston, and also their advantage over these Midwestern farms that could not get fresh produce to them. They couldn't get fresh milk to them. So it's being opportunistic, I think.
Fantastic. And I'll also, I mentioned those two gardens that were on either side of me. I will also say, as far as being entrepreneurial and creative, in those days, when tomatoes came in, you couldn't give tomatoes away because everybody had tomatoes at the same time. Everybody had, corn at the same time. So it was tough. I mean, these people weren't doing it to make money, although they tried to sell I used to go around with a basket door to door for them and see if we could sell a few vegetables to people. But they were doing it basically, they were also canning a lot of the stuff they grew. So they were, using it throughout the year. Okay, so we have two more great questions. So another attendee wants to know, how has dealing with invasive plants affected modern farming in Massachusetts, specifically at Gore Place? What do you think?
Sure. So that is another great question. So invasive species in general, not just plants, have had a huge impact on farming everywhere, but certainly in Massachusetts. And I think the first thing I want to mention is the chestnut blight. So chestnuts were everywhere. I mean, you see in the names of streets, even Chestnut Hill, right next door. Chestnuts were everywhere, and people love to eat chestnuts. They're a nice, big, a meaty nut. And I think it was around the early 20th century when this invasive fungus, which we call the chestnut blight, wipe them out. So there are basically no chestnuts left in Massachusetts. And sadly, that is not the only example. There's an aphid problem with hemlocks. There are a whole bunch of invasive pests and invasive plants, like the Japanese knotweed comes to mind, which you'll see everywhere now. Um, and these crowd out native species, or in the case of insects, they will prey on trees and plants that have never encountered an insect like, or a fungus like that before. And yeah, I mean, really, all we can, that is sadly, that's just part of ecological history. In this globalized world, things are, we see with the pandemic, things starts in one place, before you know it, it's all around the world. And I think the only thing you can do really is to diversify. It's, at Gore Place, we grow a ton of different crops. We grow, different rows next to each other. I think it's sort of a, it's called integrated pest management. That's with, with insects or with pests. But the same goes for invasive plants. And it's, trying to not necessarily destroy the invasive plant, but sort of bolstering the native ones, bolstering the good ones. So here that means, gardening, we're weeding every day, hoeing. It definitely, it makes it more difficult, but it's always been part of the ecology here. You're always dealing with invasive things. And yeah, I think the way you deal with it is just diversify. You don't rely on one crop, because an insect comes and could wipe it out. So you want to just be mindful of what you're growing, where you're growing it, and try not to put all your eggs in one basket, as they say.
And in some cases, companion planting, like you pointed out, the Native Americans did.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. Yeah, we had a problem this year with, I think we had rabbits and some groundhogs who were eating a lot of our squash. But yeah, so things like that, you put the electric fence up, and then hopefully, we were hoping that the prickly leaves on the squash would keep out predators, which is what they do, and they did keep them out for the Native Americans. But I guess we must have had a really determined groundhog, because he got through and ate a lot of our butternut squash, unfortunately.
They've evolved along with the butternut squash. All right, so
Yeah.
Susan would like to know, if the state wanted to encourage small farmers, perhaps there should be a tax rebate for using your land for production. Comments? What do you think?
I agree. So the state is doing more, I think. There is a new committee. There's a new joint committee on agriculture. So there is some interest at the state house for that. But they could definitely be doing a lot more. And I think Massachusetts sort of, if you're in charge in Massachusetts and you think about the state of the economy, you're focused more on what's going on in Cambridge, like the technology, robotics, and you're thinking like information and internet sort of things. But like this whole presentation is I've been trying to say, it's we are an agricultural state, and we have the potential to grow a lot of our own food, and especially as we see the effects of climate change, we're gonna it's healthier, but also safer, and less risky, I think, to try and grow a little bit of food everywhere, rather than just focusing it in the San Fernando Valley in California, or in the Great Lakes region. It's best to try and grow a little bit everywhere. And the state could definitely do more to encourage that. I think right now they do have some tax exemptions for farmers, that they pay less. And I know they do have another important land policy, where if you're a farmer and you own land, you can basically put in your deed, I want to keep this as farmland. And when you sell it, even after you die, the state honors that. So the next inhabitants have to continue farming that land. And so, what's it called? Wilson Farm in Lexington. That land, the reason they still farm there, even though they have a much bigger farm in New Hampshire where they grow most of their stuff, the reason they still have that farm there is because that land, part of that deed says it has to be used for agriculture. So I mean, right there in Lexington, that could go for millions of dollars, that plot of land. And I'm sure they would love to sell it to some developer to build houses there, but instead the deed, their grandfather, whoever Wilson was, whoever founded it, said, I want this land to remain in as farmland. And so that plot of land in perpetuity will remain as farmland. So I think that's a good way to help protect farms around here.
Well, that's great. So, in addition to that, just to add to the question before, Susan says homeowners could be encouraged to hire farmers to farm the homeowners' lot, since young farmers cannot afford the cost of buying land. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's interesting too. And I think sort of another way to get at that same goal of we do have young farmers, people who want to get into agriculture. I think towns should invest in community farms, and I think homeowners, it might be difficult to put the burden on homeowners to turn their land into farmland and to hire people. I think what might work better is for towns or cities to use public land, to use big public parks, and sort of use part of that to grow food. And there's a farm in, well, we have Waltham Community Fields Farm, and also we have programs here at Gore Place. And then what else? There's Landstake in Weston.
Mm-hmm.
So these towns, they invest in, they use their town's land, and they invest in a community farm. And kids from the high school, from the middle school, it's sort of a rite of passage. You work at the farm. Everyone gets to go there on a field trip and work on the farm. And I think that's a good way to educate young people and also preserve and encourage local food production.
I think, to clarify that last comment, I think the idea was that if there were tax rebates on private property on homeowners, they might be encouraged to lend their property to young farmers who need space.
Oh,
So
yeah.
as a financial incentive, it certainly would be an incentive to get your property tax lowered.
That is true. Yeah.
Incentive for many people, particularly around Middlesex County. Well, that's great. I don't think we have any more questions, Donnie. A fabulous presentation. Again, thank you so much. I just want to say, if you folks want to know more about Gore Place or more about these webinars or anything to do with Gore Place and the farm and the property there, the best thing to do is go to our website at goreplace.org. That's Gore, GOREPLACE.org. You'll get a lot of information there. And if you are of a mind to, you can also follow us on your favorite social media platform at Gore Place. So that wraps it up. Donnie, thank you again. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We will have more of these webinars in the future, because it's a wonderful way for us to tell the stories, the many, many stories about Gore Place. I have one more. Please show the wildlands and woodlands contact information again. Could you do that? The wildlands. So I'm going to answer this question. And there it is. So copy that down, folks. Wildlands, plural, and woodlands.org. And we have some, and Donnie has put it in the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat, everybody, but
Thank you, William.
The link is in the chat. And William says, oops, no more.
Oh, sorry, I put it, he just said thank you. He said he joined late.
Oh, okay. And again, William, if you joined late, if you take a look at our website later tomorrow, hopefully there will be a link up there to the recording. And if not, you can contact me at events, EVENTS, at goreplace.org. But thank you, Donnie, and so long, everybody from Gore Place, and we'll see you next time. Bye, Donnie.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.